Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and this is a video I've been trying to dodge doing for a long time, but you guys keep asking me for it. So I am going to share some thoughts around binge eating and food intolerances. One of my reasons for being reluctant to do this video before is that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a dietitian, and food intolerances exist on such a scale that I don't want to be putting out any information out there that could be misconstrued. So as usual, I'm not claiming to have all the answers, but I do have some perspectives about this that you might find interesting and might help you figure out a way through this if you're somebody who finds you're binge eating on food that you believe you are intolerant to. Firstly, binge eating is a compulsion. It's a form of disordered eating and it's a type of eating disorder. So it's not a choice, and I think it can be really frustrating when you are binging on a food that is actively harming you and you can't seem to stop. The brain doesn't know what to do with that. How do we rationalize this behavior that doesn't seem rational? So the conclusion often is, well, there's just something wrong with me. I can't believe I'm so out of control around these foods. I must be weak-willed, I must be undisciplined, I must be insert whatever critical thing it is you tell yourself about why it is that you do this behavior. But for as long as you conclude that this shameful story about who you are and why you do this is true, I think it's really hard to change. So notice what you are believing about yourself. The fact that you are binging on foods that you think are harming you, what do you make that mean about you? Whatever comes to mind, chances are that does need to be challenged in order for you to make peace with this particular type of food. And one of the tricky things when it comes to food intolerances is that they exist on a scale. So some people might eat certain foods and have this really immediate feedback of being very unwell. And other people might just find if they eat a certain amount of food, they have a bad reaction. Some of you may have been told by doctors to cut out certain foods in order to help with something else. That can be problematic because sometimes it's just advice that's thrown out there without a lot of solid medical evidence behind it. That is not me saying don't listen to your doctor though. But maybe it's about doing some research and really understanding why it is that you're being advised to cut out certain foods. So the common ones are gluten and dairy, right? So you might have some autoimmune problems and the doctor says to you, cut out gluten and dairy. That is a lot of food to cut out for someone who struggles with binge eating. And if you find yourself binge eating on these foods, it's just going to create more shame. And you may be cutting out more foods than you actually need to. Again, this is not me saying not to cut these foods out, but it's about doing your own research and understanding from your body's feedback, but also what's behind this advice, I think is a really important aspect of it. I also find that, so I'm not intolerant to any foods, but I might find that on occasion, certain foods don't make me feel great. What I have noticed is that the emotional state I'm in when I eat them makes a difference to how my body feels afterwards. So there have been times where I might have eaten bread in a rushed or slightly stressed state. Certainly in the past when I felt guilty about eating particular types of food, it always felt worse in my stomach than these days where I keep coming back to a sense of appreciation. Now it's not easy to feel that sense of appreciation around food when there's so much conflict, but we can in our minds just take a moment to give thanks for the food, looking at our emotional state and how we are when we receive the food, and just notice if it makes a difference. I know there's a lot of information out there about certain types of foods being inflammatory, and the research does seem to support this, that a diet high in refined sugar can have an inflammatory effect on the body, but so can stress. So now if you're eating, so you're binging on sugar and you're feeling stressed, there's like this double whammy. And if you are in that compulsive place with food and you're still binging on it, maybe if we work on the emotional state first, that may allow your choices to feel a little bit more like choices. Some people benefit from drawing a hard line with certain types of foods to say, I will not eat these foods, and they stick to those lines. Chances are if you're watching this video, that's not something that you find easy to do. I know I wouldn't be able to do it. I know what I'm like. So there is still an option of giving yourself permission to eat foods that you are intolerant to and accepting the consequences. Now I know this sounds a little bit controversial, but I don't believe there is a moral obligation to look after our bodies in a certain way. That isn't to say that there aren't enormous benefits, and perhaps it's preferable in terms of our experience of our lives and our health. But I think the issue becomes is when you start thinking that you are bad because of how you're treating your body. Now you think you're bad, you're not treating your body well. How are you supposed to treat your body better when you're feeling bad about yourself? It's a really difficult thing to do. However, when we feel much more appreciative and accepting of ourselves, then we're more likely to make choices that reflect that attitude that we have towards ourselves. And this is why I think seeing the pursuit of physical health as a moral issue, a bit like with food. When we look at food as a moral issue, that's where disordered eating is really bred from, because how you feel about yourself, your self-esteem is being hooked on how you eat. And it's not to say that all foods are nutritionally equal, because they're not, but they are morally equal. And I would say that's the same for how we treat these bodies. We're born into these bodies, we wear them out, and then we die. And maybe we want to have the best experience that we can in these bodies, but that as a motivation is very different to this idea that we should. And oh my goodness, I can't believe that I treat my body this way. I mean, I used to just think every time I binged, I think, gosh, I can't even feed myself. It seemed to be like one of the most basic things of having a body and looking after ourselves is being able to feed ourselves. So when something like this goes wrong, because binge eating, it's a dysregulation the whole system of eating. And it's such a scary place to be when that system feels so out of whack, when we're in compulsion. For me, in order for me to reduce my compulsion around food, what I needed to do was make my choices feel like choices. So that meant, even if there was a food that didn't agree with me, having it was an option. There was going to be consequences to having it, but if I start saying to myself, I couldn't and I shouldn't, and I get in a battle, what's going to happen is the minute I have it, the all or nothing thinking kicks off, and I'm going to eat loads of it, and then I'm going to really feel terrible about it. I've said before, I even have binging as an option now, which seems absurd considering what I do, right? If I went back to binging, my whole career is based on helping people to sort this problem out. But if I totally remove the option of ever binging again, I find myself feeling a little bit conflicted. I don't think I'll choose it. But in order for me not to choose it, it has to be a choice. And it's not a big deal. That said, I know this is a scale, so I know for some people the impact on the body is much greater than for others who might just feel a little bit uncomfortable. But there's one last thing that I want you to consider. And some of you are going to relate to this, and some of you are probably going to go, what is she talking about? I believe that our emotions, they look for a way to be expressed or managed. Let me give you an example. If somebody is at work and they are treated badly by their boss and they're really angry about it, but at work they're powerless. They can't do anything about it because they don't want to get in trouble with their boss. So they go home in a foul mood and they take it out on their partner and they're mean and angry all evening. The emotions couldn't be expressed and dealt with where they originated because it just wasn't possible to do that. The consequences were too great. So the emotions were taken home and dealt with that way. What I think sometimes happens with binging, and certainly I think a part of it was for me, is that I was feeling so uncomfortable and I had all these feelings that I wasn't really aware of. I just had this constant agitation and desire to escape and go unconscious. Was that, is it possible that even with your food tolerances, there's a part of you that wants to feel bad? It could be, and this was for me, like by turning emotional pain into physical pain, it gives, the body is able to work through something. We're like, okay, I know how to deal with physical pain. I know how to deal with this feeling after a binge. It's horrible. Sometimes I feel like I can't tolerate it, but I know it's cycle. And isn't it preferable to feel guilty and shamed about the binging, about the behavior, than, for me anyway, to feel guilty and ashamed of just who I was? At least if we feel guilt and shame about our behavior, there's a part of us that thinks, I'm going to change it, I'm going to figure it out, and then I'm not going to feel guilt and shame. But it could be a displacement of guilt and shame that sometimes we carry for just who we are and our disappointments in life and how we're showing up or not showing up in our lives. So I wonder whether sometimes binge eating performs this function of allowing these emotions to find a place when we can't just stay with ourselves and feeling that way about ourselves. The other way I see this happening, where people might deliberately want to feel bad after a binge or by binging on something that makes them feel so bad, is as a form of self-punishment, right? You dislike yourself so much, you think you deserve it. You think you deserve to feel this bad. So if you are somebody and you believe that you struggle with these food intolerances, can you get curious about what this is, about what might be playing out for you with these foods? We all do things that our bodies later pay for. I mean, take something like alcohol. Right? People go out and they'll drink alcohol and they don't feel good the next day, but they know that's going to happen on the day before. Sometimes people even plan their hangover days. They know that impact on the body, really what we're doing with our body when we've got hangovers, what we're doing to our bodies rather, probably not a great thing, right? If we're drinking to that point. But it's also a very human thing to do. And I think we get to step back and go, what am I okay with? But we've got to stop making that a moral issue. There is nothing shameful about binging on foods you're intolerant to. It's uncomfortable, sure, but it's not a shameful thing to do. Figure out where you are on this scale. Like, how severe do you consider your food intolerances to be? How disruptive are they to your life before you try and figure out a plan around these foods? Do hard lines work for you? Does saying no to a particular type of food work for you? It feels like that should be the answer, right? If we're intolerant to something, the answer should be never have that food. So then when you do have that food, now you're in a massive conflict with yourself. So I know this might sound like I'm saying, oh, don't worry about it, just binge on foods that you're intolerant to. But I'm not. I'm trying to acknowledge the fact that this does happen. And the more you tell yourself that it just shouldn't happen, and then it does, the more your self-esteem and your view of who you are gets eroded and gets bound up in this thing. You can eat the foods and choose the consequences, and really sit with yourself on how that feels to you. If that really wasn't a moral issue, quite often it frees us up to hear our own intuition about that. I think the thing that cuts us off the most from ourselves and hearing our own quiet wisdom is the judgment, is the sense that we think we know what the answer should be, rather than saying, I don't know what the answer is. How do I feel about it? And that involves getting quiet and listening to ourselves. And consider if there's a punishing element to these food intolerances in the way that you're eating when you have them, or whether you might be trying to work something through emotionally. That's why people often find when they start doing the emotional work, when they start feeling their feelings just in life anyway, that the urge, that compulsion starts to reduce. So those are just a few thoughts. If any of you there struggle with food intolerances and binge eating and you found certain things that support you, do let people know in the chat below. And thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.